Hello everyone. Hi, I'm Gerard Stewart. I'm the Communications Coordinator for the NFM Research Programme. Welcome to the 20th in our webinar series in which we aim to share knowledge and experience with practitioners and researchers in the NFM field. Today we're really pleased to have Marcus and Simon from Oxford University presenting to us. Before I hand over to them, just a couple of housekeeping points and a brief introduction to or overview of the webinar programme. Oops, sorry. So please turn off your cameras and mute your microphones to avoid distractions. Please do ask questions and make comments using the chat function, and please feel free to respond to other people's comments and questions. The webinar is being recorded and we'll make it available hopefully later today on our website. Okay, sorry, there's a delay between my computer and the screen. So the webinar programme, it's a 4-year, £4 million programme funded by NERC, and we're carrying out a novel science to improve the understanding of NFM, where possible including quantification. We're looking at a range of NFM measures in different types of catchments and in different flooding scenarios and at different scales. And the aim is to improve evidence and understanding for policymakers and practitioners. There are 3 projects making up the programme, which have been carried out in geographically different areas of the country and looking at slightly different aspects of NFM, and you can find out more about those on our website, and indeed they each have their own websites. A really key part of our work is working with partners. We wouldn't be able to do it without our partners, and today is an example of that. So whilst Simon and Marcus's work isn't actually part of the programme, we're really pleased that we can help provide a platform to share their work and in a way help to build an NFM excuse me, an NFM community. So I think that's probably enough for me. I'll hand over to Simon and Marcus.
Great. Thanks very much, Gerard. Let me just check that you can hear me okay.
Yes, I can hear you fine. Yeah.
And I will share my slides now just so we can check that they're coming up okay as well. And can I check they're coming up in presenter mode because it's showing in full screen mode? Yeah, good. Okay, well, thanks very much for the invitation to speak, and in particular for contextualizing this presentation in the NERC NFM within the NERC NFM funding programme. What I'm going to talk about and Marcus and I are going to talk about for the bulk of the presentation is really talking in very broad terms about the scientific evidence base for natural flood risk management, and particularly in the context of a piece of work that we embarked upon some years now, almost 6 or 7 years ago it was now, to try to collate for a broad audience the published academic research that has been done on natural flood risk management, and one of the, I'll go through the various findings of that research in this presentation, and one of the findings was that it would be, one of the conclusions was that it would be extremely beneficial both for the research and academic community, but also for the practitioner community, to have a series of funded programs to look at improving the evidence base for natural flood risk management. And so it's wonderful that NERC and also DEFRA have committed a significant amount of funding to that programme. And as we have seen in previous seminars in this excellent series, as we've seen, evidence over the past 5 years is emerging in various different fields. And so towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to, in fact, Marcus is going to say a few things about a project that we have currently underway to update the evidence base that we created 5 years ago, to take account of many of these new strands of emerging evidence. And we'll talk a bit about the way in which that is going, and also say a little bit about how people, perhaps some of whom on this call, might like to contribute to the process that is going on there. So it probably needs no introduction that the UK is subject to a range of flood risks. It will be pretty evident to the people on this call, I'm sure. I've given some examples there. There's the famous picture of Tewkesbury Abbey in the foreground there, which is sitting on an area of high ground which escaped the flooding in 2007, but which shows exactly how much traditional knowledge was embedded in the ways in which people engage with the environment, with the landscapes that they are living in. Clearly they knew something about flooding when they decided to put the abbey in that particular place. And then behind you can see, just peeping out, another image showing flooding on the Thames. This is flooding on the Thames in, I think it's 2003, looking out over the floodplain in Wallingford, and you can just about see on the edge of that floodplain in the top of the slide, the NERC Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, also comfortably located, as you'd hope, away from the area that's liable to flooding. So flooding is a big problem in the UK. The losses associated with the 15-16 floods, on which a number of the debates around natural flood risk management turn, have been estimated to be, I think the slide hasn't updated since that figure has been estimated at 1.3 to 1.9 billion total losses by the Environment Agency. The figure on there is slightly out of date, but the losses are clearly considerable, and so all appropriate measures are up for consideration when it comes to looking at managing flood risk. I'm going to talk mainly about fluvial flood risk in this presentation. Of course, pluvial flooding, groundwater flooding, coastal flooding, and various forms of urban flooding are important in the UK as well. But mostly I'm going to be talking about fluvial flooding from rivers overtopping their banks. And as I said before, one of the sort of iconic events in recent years is Storm Desmond, and a lot of the public discourse has been concerned with flooding and the factors that contributed towards the damage that has happened in not just this particular storm. It's iconic of a number of major storms that we've had in the last decade, which have caused significant flood damage. Storm Desmond, of course, was particularly extreme, bringing I think it's 341 millimeters in one day at the gauge at Honister Pass, which is estimated to be a rainfall with recurrence interval of or with exceedance probability of 0.08, so roughly 1 in 1200, 1300 years. Pretty extreme, extremely extreme, and obviously provoking a lot of discussion and debate about whether it was a one-off event, an event that could never have been anticipated, whether it was could be attributed to climate change in some degree. And importantly, when it comes to discussing natural flood risk management, the extent to which land use and farming practices were implicated in the way that the rainfall got translated into floodwaters. And this is really important because there are many things, of course, that we can do about managing our land, and we have agency as communities. We have agency over that in ways that we might have less agency over the weather as a whole. But it's interesting to look back over time, and it provides a bit of context and a bit of perspective to look back at events like that in their historical context. And we have to remember that even though those events were, and I'm shifting down to the southeast of the country now, to the Thames Basin, even though extreme floods that we've seen in the past decade have been extreme in relation to much of our living memory. If you go back into the deep history of areas, and the Thames history is very well recorded. If you go back deep into the history of flooding on those rivers, you'll see, and this is a flood record from a building along the Thames Path as you go past. If you walk from Shillingford to Wallingford along the Thames, you'll see that those extreme storms of the 21st century are in fact not even in the top 10 of the extreme flood levels that were seen on the Thames. The data that is shown there from the NRFA National River Flow Archive record of peak flows, and you'll see that the 2014 flooding in February only made it to number 12 in that long record, which goes back a long time. We have the very well-known floods of 1894 and 1947, which significantly surpassed in terms of their level. And in terms of the flow here measured at Kingston. And so there's some interesting scientific questions around what we might expect in the future, whether we're expecting to see more extreme rainfall, and how we should contextualize the types of flooding that we've seen in the past. So in outline, what I want to talk about in this presentation is divided into 4 sections. One, to talk about the drivers of flooding, climate variability and climate change, in particular to look at land cover, changes in land cover, and then to discuss in very broad terms some of the different catchment-based and natural flood management options and possibilities that, of course, many people on the call will have deep practical experience of, but to see if we can put some of those into their context and to think about exactly what hydrological effect they have, what the benefit of them is likely to be, where the evidence is strong for those benefits, and where we're in need of additional studies to characterize the effect of these measures, and also to understand their broader benefits for the environment and for society. I'll give some examples. There are many examples that could be given, and so I've focused on 3 in this case, because they allow me to pick out particular points that I think have informed the debate and informed the discussion. There are, of course, many examples of practical schemes where natural flood risk management measures have been implemented. And then draw some conclusions around what general principles we can come away with, and how we might usefully proceed in understanding the basis of this field. So looking back, and we've looked a little bit already at some of the long-lived, long-duration records of river flow. This is one of rainfall, and it shows very clearly. This is from the Radcliffe Met Station at Oxford. You can see in the top photograph on the right hand side there, the Radcliffe Observatory, which is one of the oldest scientific buildings in the country, and in the foreground of that is a standard Met Office regulation compound for measuring meteorological variables. And this station goes back many years in lots of different forms. But what's recorded here is a synthesis of England and Wales precipitation between 1776 and it goes beyond 2015, but that's what's shown on the slide. And you can see from the slide several things. You can see that even though in the top panel you can fit a pretty close to straight line between the rainfall variability, which is happening across that period. There isn't a very distinct trend. In fact, there is no significant trend in the total rainfall received over that period. If we split the precipitation into winter and summer, we do start to see some interesting patterns. And possibly more importantly, if we look at particular episodes within that record, it seems as though there's strong evidence from the paleoclimatic record and from the historical climate record. There's strong evidence that episodes of high rainfall tend to come in fits and starts. They come in floods, in flood-rich and flood-poor periods. And so we can zoom into a different data set here compiled by Wilby and Quinn, and this is looking at flood-rich and flood-poor periods in the historical record. And so what's important to see here is that we have a number of times during the historical past where the climate system that provides the storms that drive the flooding over the UK are locked into a flood-rich mode. We saw particularly in the late part of the 19th century such a thing, and remember the 1894 floods on the Thames, which I mentioned earlier on. And in the first part of the 20th century as well, from about 1910 to 1930 on the slide there. But there are equally flood poor periods, and crucially from the point of view of the evolution of flood risk management policy, that period between 1950 and pretty much the end of the 1990s was relatively flood poor. And so a lot of the urban expansion after the Second World War, a lot of the flood policies that have been put in place since the Second World War have been in the context of a relatively flood poor climatic regime. There are lots of interesting physical climatology reasons why the climate system would be locked in this flood poor mode during that period, and there's evidence starting to emerge that it's to do with sea surface temperatures in the North Atlantic and the way in which they fuel the depressions that travel across the Atlantic to bring us our characteristic rainstorms. But what's distinct about this figure is that after about 2000, after the late 1990s, the climate system to some extent switches to a more flood-rich mode of variability, and there's evidence accumulating and has accumulated even further over the 5 years since we published our study on this simulation on this distillation of evidence, that sequence of flood-rich and flood poor periods is continuing. So it's very important to have this context, to understand what the climatological context is for this variability. Climate variability going back over a long period is accessible to us through historical records and through the paleoenvironmental record. But it doesn't tell us anything about the future, and we know that in over the past few decades, trends in high flows have been increasing, and that the regional picture is complicated. I'm taking some work here from some time ago by Jamie Hannaford, looking at the evidence for more extreme floods in the north and west. The spatial picture of these changes, even though the previous slide was looking at the country as a whole, the spatial pattern of these changes is also very distinct. You see areas where high flows have increased, and areas, particularly in the south and east of the country, where the opposite has happened, and that poses other problems. It poses problems when we're trying to look at water resources sustainability and low flows and so on. So there's a rich variety of variability. There's rich variability in the data set, and we expect that pattern of variability and that pattern of change to continue with climate change. A number of studies published recently showing a range of spatial expressions of climate change patterns that we're likely to see over the British Isles. Which is interesting. A lot of the evidence which is emerging in the last decade or so is evidence for increased convective storm intensities, and very many of the models that are used to project rainfall into the future are showing increases in convective storm intensity alongside the warming signal. So in terms of planning, for the future, we need to plan with adaptation measures that are designed to cope with a very wide range of changes. So climate variability is obviously what drives a lot of the flooding that we see, but those waves of water, those storms that pass across the British Isles, are modulated in the way that they turn that climate variability into flooding by the vegetation, by the land cover, by the soils, by the river channels, and other aspects of the catchment that they pass through. And you can see very distinctly in this map. This is a map of showing forest cover some time ago now, in 2000, over the whole of Europe, and you can see very distinctively that compared with its equivalent latitudes, forest cover at that time was and continues to be much lower than forest cover is at equivalent latitudes across Europe. Prehistoric forest cover, of course, was present across the whole of the UK, or whole of Great Britain, but you have to go back a long time before that forest cover is found to be widespread. Early in the Neolithic period, people developed the technology to clear land and to convert it to agricultural use, and so you have to go back some 6,000 years before the native prehistoric forest cover was present across the UK, and the low point was in the 1930s, where forest cover was reduced to 6%, and it's currently increasing, and I'm sure there'll be people on the call who can give an updated figure for 2021, but it's currently increasing, and that is regarded as a good thing from the point of view of biodiversity. Particularly if it is accompanied with de-intensification of farming practices and sustainable land management in other ways. I think one of the conclusions which I might sort of pre-flag here is that not all forest cover is identical. There's a strong case for being very careful in the way in which additional forestry is planned and implemented across a country like the UK. So alongside the climate variability and change aspect of the picture, we see also distinct variability in land cover change in the form of forest as depicted here, but also grassland and urban change as well. So this provokes an interesting discussion around if we've seen such changes over the historical past, to what extent can we intervene in the landscape to alter flood risk as it is perceived in communities? And broadly speaking, I have distinguished in this presentation between catchment-based flood management and natural flood management. Catchment-based flood management, really, when we're speaking about catchment-based flood management, we're thinking about interventions which manage or seek to manage flood risk within the catchment upstream of the area where the flood risk is itself or the flood hazard is itself experienced. That's important because for much of the 20th century, management of flooding has been focused on managing flood hazard at the locations where that hazard is experienced through engineered flood defences or through management of water so that it doesn't flood areas directly. And this is an important distinction to make, this idea that we can try to affect flood risk further upstream in the catchment by in placing a range of different interventions. Broadly speaking, those interventions can be divided into three categories. There are many different types of intervention, but I've divided them here into three categories. Interventions which seek to retain water in the landscape by managing infiltration, managing overland flow, particularly focusing on soils and vegetation. A second category, retaining water in the landscape by managing the connectivity and conveyance, the ways in which that water, once it's been generated as runoff, is transmitted through the soils and slowing that flow, retaining that flow and diverting it through different structures and different mechanisms. Is that second category. And then the third category there is making room for water by managing the floodplain and managing the conveyance of water downstream once it has been received in rivers. Obviously, within each of those categories, and I'll go on to say a bit more about them in detail later on, within each of those categories, there are distinct differences in the interventions that can be used. But distinguishing and grouping things into those categories helps us, I think, to understand what the benefits are of each particular type of intervention and where in the catchment, relatively speaking, the intervention is likely to be most successful. Natural flood management, of course, is the title of the program and the title of the seminar series, is often considered to be a form of catchment-based flood management. There is some overlap and there are some differences between the two. Not all NFM interventions have to be based upstream in the catchment, and not all catchment-based flood management has to be what might be referred to as natural. But by and large, the definition that has become commonly used is flood management which seeks to restore processes that are adversely affected by development. Much debate in the academic literature, which is possibly not worth going into at the moment, but much debate in the academic literature about what exactly natural means in this context, because in a country like the UK, where you have to go back to the Neolithic before you see true natural vegetation, as it were, many of the things that we see in our landscapes are cultural legacies from our prehistory and from our historical course that we have taken as well. And history in the making, I can only see part of the question that is coming through, but yeah, we stand. I agree. I think with the at least the first sentence of the person who's commented in the chat, that we stand to make what is possibly the most far-reaching intervention in the structure of our landscapes over the next few years, and so it's very important that that those interventions are designed and thought about carefully and with regard to their effect on the aquatic environment. So examples of natural flood management: interventions that aim to reduce flood hazard, sustain and enhance other aquatic, riparian, terrestrial ecosystem services, and they might include things like improved soil and water quality, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, reduction in soil erosion. A big body of evidence showing that some of the measures which are effective, most effective at reducing flooding, are equally, if not more effective at reducing soil erosion, and that is a hugely important problem, which I'll come on to a little bit later on. Greater agricultural productivity, depending on definition of productivity, that is a desirable or not outcome, and improve public health and well-being. Hugely important, but notoriously difficult to quantify. So a range of possible benefits, and one of the major challenges that we see in understanding how the role that natural flood management can play is making the appropriate evaluation of how those co-benefits that are evident in many of the implemented natural flood risk management schemes should be evaluated in relation to more straightforward traditional flood risk management schemes where the investment has come for flood risk management and flood risk management is what's being implemented. There's a need which we have flagged and continue to flag over. There's a need to articulate the co-benefits and to measure the co-benefits more effectively. Usually natural flood risk management projects are implemented to solve a particular problem, and this is a catalogue, a database, which is presented by JBA, Jeremy Benn Associates, showing a range of practitioner-led NFM projects across the country. And you can see that even within, I prepared this slide for a talk in Westminster, even within the M25, there are some 25 more NFM projects, even within the M25, and so it's usually people, local communities who have identified a local flood risk management problem and are tackling it in a way that is tailored and suits their particular needs. Some peer-reviewed examples, some examples in the academic literature of studies which have sought to quantify in an objective way the impact of catchment-based flood management and natural flood risk management, listed on the screen there. And you can see that these are from across a range of geographical locations in the country and across a range of scales. But crucially, they don't go up beyond, in this particular case, they don't go up beyond 260 square kilometres. And one of the crucial needs in the evidence base is to create well-designed studies which look at large areas and interventions across large areas, and which monitor the effects of NFM over those large areas, because it's often in our biggest rivers that flood risk is of headline importance, and so it's very important to bear in mind that scale effect as we go through the different range of interventions. I'm just pulling out an example here from Pontbrenne, familiar to many people, I'm sure. Relatively small area, 18 square kilometres in total, where the local community, having identified a particular problem that they wished to solve, came together and planted tree shelter belts, areas of tree planting, informal tree planting along river channels, and in focused areas of the upland catchment. And this study, having been instrumented by a combination of UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and Imperial College, found some really interesting conclusions about the impact, both locally, the impact of planting trees on infiltration rates. The quoted number is 67 times increase in infiltration rates in the areas where trees were planted, and crucially attributing that change in infiltration rates to the planting of trees and not just the exclusion of grazing animals. But interestingly, when you move downstream to the scale of the small catchment rather than the plot scale, where the tree shelter belts themselves were in place, the reduction in extreme flood peaks was between 2 and 11%. Now, whether you think 2 and 11%, that number is a big number or not, depends largely on what is being impacted by the flood, and if the benefits of planting trees in shelter belts are evident anyway, then it's a very beneficial reduction in extreme flood peaks. But it is nonetheless a much smaller reduction than would be imagined if you look just at the headline figure of 67% increase in infiltration rates. Essentially, as the benefits of tree planting are diffused from a small plot-sized area to a larger catchment, the reduction in floodwater generation, flood peaks decreases. One really interesting conclusion here is that was found here in a separate study by different colleagues, is the reduction in suspended sediment load and bed load, particularly involving agricultural pollution as well, that was seen as a result of the shelter belts, and that's a co-benefit which needs to be taken into account and may in some cases be the principal reason for installing these measures in the first place. Looking at a broader catchment, a bigger catchment here, the Hodder is another multi-scale study looking at upland drainage management, reduction in sheep numbers, and interestingly, the experimental design in the Hodder study was to look at exactly how the benefits of drainage management and reduction in grazing animals would scale as things move, as the effects move downstream. And that's exactly what was found in the Hodder study, that the impact was relatively modest at the scale, at the small scale, the kilometre scale of the plots in which these interventions were made. And by the time things had moved downstream to a larger catchment, the benefits became harder to discern. Different kind of study, and here a study which is combining different sorts of flood risk management intervention at Pickering, and what you see here is a combination of measures in the upland catchment, large wood, timber bunds, and bale check dams, some riparian woodland and on-farm woodland, and also buffer strip planting. So a range of different measures in the upland area, but also an off-channel, more engineered storage bund, which is designed according to standard engineering principles to hold a certain amount of water and to protect Pickering downstream against the 0.04 annual exceedance probability flood. And so here's a very interesting combination of things which, recall my point earlier about whether catchment-based flood management must it be natural, or are there ways to combine traditional and more natural techniques? Here it's two things working together, which is wonderful from the point of view of protecting communities, from the point of view of producing schemes which combine a portfolio of measures. It makes our job as academics a little bit harder to attribute any reduction in flood risk to particular components that have been in place in order to manage flood risk, and so really I think the community is waiting for major flood events to happen in this area before that definitive statement can be said about whether the flood risk protection comes from the concrete engineered storage bund or from the upstream measures. So drawing together, and this is a figure which is really designed as a sort of discussion piece, really as a summary, a graphical summary of the evidence that we compiled in our earlier report, drawing together the types of intervention that might be used to manage a particular problem. The evidence to date has shown that the smaller the flood and the smaller the catchment, the more likely it is that land management based interventions are going to be effective. As you move either downstream to bigger river catchments, or start thinking about larger, more rarer and floods of higher magnitude, then it's interventions which create room for floodwater to be stored, off-channel storage ponds, or restored wetlands, areas where the river is connected better to its natural floodplain, which are more likely to be promising in terms of natural flood risk management. So the 5 recommendations that that we offer here are that we need very much, from an academic point of view, to maintain the monitoring networks in order to be able to inform policy in this area. We need, and we still need, even 5 years on, we still need to extend our modelling studies to larger catchments and to include multiple processes, and there have been many advances in that area. We need to understand the particular co-benefits that might arise as a result of natural flood risk management. And interestingly, over the past couple of years, some of the disbenefits, I must say, of particularly of proposals to plant trees in widespread fashion across large swathes of land, because that has an impact on low flows and drought risk as well. To understand the co-benefits and the way that they interact, and also the way in which they can be evaluated alongside other traditional flood management interventions. Practitioner toolkit and evaluation protocol, I think these are areas, and also improved stakeholder communication, these are areas where the DEFRA NFM pilots and the NERC NFM project in particular is making great strides and has the potential to make an enormous difference. It is certainly the case that you know, a community that has a flood risk problem can approach a range of different practitioners, and we're finding, even over the last 5 years, that the NFM tools in the toolbox are present to be implemented in ways that bring positive benefits to the landscape all round. What's important is that we continue to maintain the monitoring networks and to make sure that what we invest in is interventions that work and that provide value for money. So I am going at this point to hand over to Marcus, who's going to who is leading the compilation of evidence for an update to the review that we published in 2017. 5 years hence, there's been an enormous amount of activity, and so many of the conclusions that we've drawn have been either bolstered or new evidence is emerging to add to the conclusions that can be drawn. And Marcus is just going to take a few minutes to talk through things that are emerging from that process, and also to explain how anyone on the call whose organisation wishes to get involved with that can do so. So, with luck, I will invite Marcus to take. I'll keep my slides, I think, but I'll invite Marcus to turn on his video and present the next couple of slides.
Brilliant, cool. Thanks, Simon. So yeah, next slide, if you can just go on to the next one, please. Cool, thank you. So considering the sort of current state of play with things, so as Simon said earlier, there has been investment in sort of the natural flood management from NERC and DEFRA. So examples of this is both the National Infrastructure Assessment and the National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy for England, which will provide about 200 million between 2021 and 27, have recommended natural flood management amongst one of many different things for future funding priorities. And as part of DEFRA's 25-year environment plan, there's also been large investments that are being promised in the field of natural flood management. So we continue to see natural flood management being referred to in both policy and legislation. So, of course, with the influence of the UK leaving the European Union, we've had the introduction of the Agriculture Act, which introduced the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which, when it's implemented between 2024 and 27, will try and include measures to reduce flooding by incentivising farmers and land managers to store excess water on their lands. And as Simon's been talking about before, there's been a lot of talk about large-scale tree planting and peatland restoration as we try, as a nation, to try and achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, something that was put as an amendment to the Climate Change Act in 2019, which committed us to try and reach these goals. So as always in life, you know, there continues to be a real emphasis to implement natural flood management, you know, where it works and where it can provide value for money. particularly as we tackle record-breaking storms such as Storm Dennis right at the start of 2020, and in particular with many nationally critical infrastructure assets and roughly about 10% of newly built homes still situated on floodplains. So over the last year or so, we've been collecting additions to the evidence base in terms of natural flood management. So looking at peer-reviewed literature from about 2016 onwards. We use some search terms generated from the sections in the last natural flood management restatement. So we use Web of Science, Scopus, and Google Scholar. And then altogether, that sort of generated a database of peer-reviewed literature for about 500 different pieces of studies that we found. We then had a sort of meeting with all the co-authors where we collated all of this together. And then from there, we tried to identify gaps and discuss the findings. So we're currently working, or we have a working draft as an update to the 2017 paper. And in a second, I'd just quickly like to share some of our preliminary conclusions and updates, and as Simon said, how you can get involved with contributing. So our first point is that we find interventions continue to be mainly at a local scale. So that means, although it's great, we can see the impact of natural flood management on small localized events, it's quite difficult to determine how these may scale up over larger catchment. For example, how the work that's been done in Pickering, how could that be scaled up to something as big and as grand as the Thames? And as Simon was saying, once again, with the impact of widespread afforestation, in uplands and floodplains, how are they going to have an impact? Not just at the plot scales where we have some really good observations, but how will that have an overall impact at catchment scale, not localized plot scales? So in addition to that, the conclusions from the studies continue to be very catchment specific. So that's in terms of topography they have, the land cover, soils, drainage density, climate. And so again, it makes it very difficult to try and generalize the impact of these natural flood management measures. So, if you're trying to translate what the effects of a natural flood management measure would have on one catchment, you can't just say, oh, it works in this catchment in this way, it'll do exactly the same in the other. It's still difficult to try and move one to the other. There's been a lot of great work. There's a lot of model studies that have come out in regards to natural flood management, which have been fantastic to try and help us understand, the theoretical impact that natural flood management may have. But there continues to be quite a lot of uncertainty in these models that's not really considered enough potentially. Factors such as parameter choices. So, these, of course, can be influenced by non-stationarity, things changing in the landscape. So, models can have been calibrated for certain current time periods with certain land cover, certain climate. But, we're trying to understand how land cover changes in the future, climate changes in the future are going to actually impact the effectiveness of these natural flood management. So caution really needs to be used when looking and applying these studies. We call for sort of some more consistency potentially in quantifying both the benefits and, as Simon said, the disbenefits of natural flood management schemes. Of course, each one of these schemes has its own agenda, its own funding priorities in terms of what they're looking at and what they're measuring. But again, that makes it quite difficult when you're trying to compare, similar different natural flood management measures. How will they, one that may be looking at the water quality, how did that actually influence flood peaks and vice versa? Just like to mention though, carbon storage is an exception to this, where we think there's been some good work in terms of an investment into understanding our capacity and measure to quantify the impacts of natural flood management on these factors such as carbon storage. And then sort of finally, there is sort of a continued need to fund monitoring of these natural flood management measures over large temporal and spatial scales. So we need to make sure that there's enough monitoring, not just after installation, but before installation, so we can make a really good comparison between the two. And in addition to that, it would be great to sort of have some monitoring sites where there's no intervention. You know, a good counterfactual, something we can say, here's a catchment in the same time at the same scale that has no intervention, and compare it to a sort of a similar catchment where they're exactly the same properties but with an intervention. So on a positive note, you know, remote sensing really offers some great opportunities on this front that, you know, we should really actively encourage to improve our knowledge of natural flood management effectiveness, you know, such as the use of drones, structure for motion, all of that great work. So as Simon said before, we're going to be holding a stakeholder review about the work that we've done thus far, and would really appreciate any honest and open feedback you would have, because, you know, this is collaborative feedback, you know, not just the academic and research, but also practitioners. And it'd be great, you know, for you to get involved and help shape what this restatement looks like. So if you have anything you'd like to raise, please email me with the email address right at the bottom. I'll also put it in the chat as well, so you can use it. So make sure to take that email address away, just because Microsoft Chat sometimes disappear these days. But yes, without further ado, many thanks for listening. Really appreciate your time today, and we look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Good, thanks, Marcus, and thank you from me too. Gerard, I don't know if you want to chair the questions or if you'd like me to go through the ones that are being posted in the chat. Over to you.
I'm happy for you to pick out the ones that you think are most interesting.
Great. Okay, there are loads. Thank you very much for all of the questions that have been put in the chat. I'm going to pick out a few. There's one from Thea Wingfield on the distinction between catchment-based flood risk management and natural flood management. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of terms that are being used in this field. Catchment-based approach is one, natural flood risk management is another. The other two which are common are working with natural processes and nature-based solutions, and they all in a sense have a different heritage and come from a different community and all mean slightly different things. It's a sort of favorite pastime of academics to dwell on what definition is what and things like that. So it's possibly less important in the practical implementation of such measures. But really, the difference I was trying to highlight in relation to catchment-based versus point of hazard flood risk management is making modifications upstream in the catchment that impact flood hazard downstream, and those interventions may be considered natural or not as natural, as I think some other commentators have put in the chat too, versus natural flood risk management, which has at its heart the idea of restoring landscapes and ecosystems to take account of the adverse effects of human development. So, and then a few comments on infiltration rates. Yes, essentially the point that I was making is that whilst you can have a very large headline figure, the impact it has when aggregated downstream is very different. So fully agree with that comment there. Let's have a look now. Thank you to those who've posted additional materials in the chat. We'll certainly take those on board. And then a very good point about reconnecting rivers with their floodplain. This is Chris Farmer. Greatest gain for lowland flood management is to reverse some of the areas where flood banks were put in for agricultural gain. Yes, we in our conclusions have noted that as an area where, particularly for large floodwaters where you can store a lot of water on a floodplain, that's likely to have by far the greatest of all the effects that could be had by these sorts of interventions when we're dealing with lowland flooding. Tom Nisbet, question about process understanding. Yes, absolutely, and that's one of the sort of slower strands of evidence to come together, because it involves needing to instrument catchments, and it involves needing to extend that instrumentation over wide areas. Lots of interesting developments in the offing at the moment around how we might, as a country, fund that sort of infrastructure going forward, but it is very important to do. And there are one or two sort of shining lights in terms of process studies, which particularly publications coming out in the very recent past. I think I saw a comment from Andrew Black about something, and note the fascinating work at Eddleston Water, which is doing that instrument, or has done that instrumentation over a long period of time. So that's a brilliant paper that we've just seen.
Yes, right, but there's a webinar on that work in a couple of months. So the Eddleston Water work.
Excellent. This is a question for Marcus. I don't know if it's perhaps a little unfair of me to bat this one to Marcus, but I have a view on it myself, so I'm happy to chip in. But since it is addressed to Marcus, a very good point about scaling up monitoring from local to wider catchment scale. This is from Chrissa Brown. But how does it actually work in practice? Is it not a really challenging thing to do?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I mean, I'm probably going to say the last thing. It is a very difficult thing to do. I mean, the idea is to try and understand, the physical processes that are occurring at your plot scale, at these small scales, and saying, okay, if these processes of the different parts that you're targeting, so we say you're foresting, you're increasing evaporation, maybe increasing infiltration. Okay, at the larger scales, how will that work on the catchment? You have these certain properties of your catchment, so you say certain soils, you understand that planting these types of trees will work with these types of soils. You can then try and expand to larger scales. I mean, so there's great work which is, like the modeling stuff, which is all about that, our theoretical world where we do widespread land cover changes, and that's a really great way of trying to, understand what's happening at larger scales. However, as I said before, sometimes there are uncertainties that are not fully addressed, so trying to apply it from these, very nuanced examples wider makes it difficult. But I don't know, Simon, did you want to have your opinion? Maybe I was not on board with you.
No, I agree completely with that assessment, and perhaps in my response would draw together some of the things that other questioners have asked. Particularly Ed Byers is saying that even if people want to do monitoring or would like to do monitoring, it's very hard sometimes to get the funding or to get the technical equipment or expertise to do that. And I think that is an area where the NFM pilot and to a lesser extent the NFM pilot, but to a greater extent the NERC NFM scheme have made a big difference, or are making a big difference in that area. Often. And I think it's either Ed or someone else it is Ed who makes this point. Often schemes such as these are put in place by local community groups, or small charities, or relatively modestly resourced groups of people who might be relying on volunteers and so on. And of course, if you're faced with the choice of doing the work or monitoring its effect, then you're going to want to allocate resource to, if it's limited to doing the work. And so I think, as I said once in a different context, I think it is the role of government, of the public funders, DEFRA, NERC, and so on, to step in where it is where it's possible to do that, to help with that instrumentation. And somebody has mentioned, Andrew has mentioned the FDRI program, the Flood and Drought Research Infrastructure program, which is currently being scoped up by NERC for really making a step change. It would be a multi-million-pound investment in this kind of monitoring, and there's a big opportunity here for people to feed into that. And for that to provide the sorts of evidence that we need, not just for monitoring NFM, but for making a much more holistic, concerted effort to instrument our water environment. We're probably up against the clock,
That's right. We've got about a minute left, Simon.
A minute
so
left. Yes, Tom Nisbet makes reference to a really interesting study by Trev Page and Nick Chappell, which is part of the, I think it's part of the QNFM project,
right,
looking at wet canopy evaporation. And this is really starting to challenge some of the sort of received views in the field, and certainly something we've spent a long time looking at in the update to our evidence review restatement. The idea that that wet canopy evaporation can be much higher than had previously been thought. But again, is that there's a lot of spatial variability and variability across different landscapes, and that I think is possibly the single message that needs to be drawn out from everything that we've said, and that's that it's horses for courses often in many of these contexts, and there's no substitute for local expertise in understanding what might work in which particular context. On which point I think we're up against the clock, and I might hand back to you, Gerard.
Right, so great, thanks very much. Yeah, thank you both, Simon and Marcus, for excellent, very clear presentations and excellent answering of questions as well, and taking some work off me as well by chairing the questions at the end. So can you see my screen? Yeah.
Yes, we can. Thank you
Good.
from us for organising it as well. It's a great seminar series, and it's very nice to have the opportunity to talk to this group.
Brilliant. Yeah, well, thank you. So yes, just to conclude quickly, if you do have follow-up questions or for Simon or Marcus, there's their contact details below, or if you'd like to get in touch with us, there's our contact details as well. The recording will be available on our website, I hope later today, and I'll also post the slides from Simon and Marcus. Our next webinar is some work from the Landwise project, so one of the projects within the NFM research programme on modelling LFM in lowland catchments. I've posted a link to sign up for our newsletter. If you do that, you'll not only receive the occasional newsletter, but also updates on upcoming webinars, and hopefully see you at the next one. So just finally, thanks again, excellent presentation today, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Goodbye.
Thanks, Gerard. Thanks for organising it.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye.